During our vacation, my wife suddenly collapsed and was rushed to the emergency room. When the doctor walked in, he looked at me and asked, "Are you the patient's family member?" I froze because the man standing before me was my son, the son I had lost 7 years ago. I couldn't say a word, only standing there watching him take care of my wife. I stepped closer to him, but what terrified me was not his familiar face. It was what I was about to discover. Thank you so much for joining me on Dad's Revenge Stories. I would love to know where my audience is located today. Drop your city or country in the comments. Please remember, this tale contains fictional elements designed to entertain and educate. Resemblances to actual events or identities are entirely coincidental, but the takeaway is profoundly practical. The morning we left for Lisbon, my wife spent 20 minutes standing in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to decide whether to wear her blue scarf. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, watching her through the open doorway, and I thought, this is it. This is the whole of a good life right here. A woman I have loved for 40 years, arguing with her own reflection over a piece of silk, the color of the September sky outside our window. "Walter?" Evelyn said, not turning around. "Does this look ridiculous? Be honest." "You look like the first day I ever saw you," I told her. She turned and pointed the scarf at me like a weapon. "That is not an answer. I was 22 years old then. I am 63 now. And you are more beautiful at 63 than you were at 22, I said, which I did not think was possible. So you can imagine my surprise. She laughed that full, unguarded laugh that she only lets out when she forgets to be self-conscious, and looped the scarf around her neck. "You are a terrible liar, Walter James Reed. But you are my terrible liar, so I suppose you can stay." 40 years, and she's still deciding whether to keep me? I said to no one in particular. We had arrived in Lisbon 2 days before flying business class for the first time in our lives, because our daughter-in-law, because Serena had insisted. A gift, she called it, pressing the printed itinerary into my hands, with that wide, practiced smile of hers. 40 years of marriage deserved something special, she said. She had even arranged for a car to take us to the airport. I had been moved by it at the time. Standing on the balcony of our room at the Bairro Alto Hotel that morning, with the river Tagus spreading out silver and wide below us, and the red rooftops of the old city catching the early light, I thought about how far we had come, Evelyn and I. We had started in a 2-bedroom apartment in Hartford with a broken radiator and a mattress on the floor. We had built something together, slowly and imperfectly, the way most real things are built. A home. A life. A son. Nathaniel, even after 7 years, his name still landed in my chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples going outward in every direction, never quite settling. "You're thinking about him again," Evelyn said. She had come to stand beside me, her shoulder warm against mine. She did not phrase it as a question, because after 40 years she did not need to. "I always think about him," I said. "Me too." She rested her head against my shoulder, and we stood there for a moment, the two of us looking out at a city neither of us had ever seen before. Nathaniel had always wanted to come to Europe. He used to keep a list on his phone cities he planned to visit someday. Lisbon was on it. I knew because I had found that list on his old laptop 3 months after we lost him, and I had sat in his desk chair and read every single entry until I could not see the screen anymore. We had not talked about that this morning. We had made an agreement without ever saying so out loud to let this trip be something lighter. A chance to breathe. 40 years was worth celebrating, and we were still here, still standing, still choosing each other every morning. That counted for something. "Come on," Evelyn said, pushing off from the railing with the energy she always summoned when she decided a moment had gone on long enough. "I want pastel de nata before the good bakery runs out. I read online that you have to get there before 9. It is 7:45. Then we are already behind schedule. She grabbed her handbag from the chair by the door, checked that her blue scarf was properly arranged, and held out her hand to me. I took it. I took it the way I had taken it 10,000 times before, without thinking the way you reach for something that has always been exactly where you expect it to be. We had breakfast at a small cafe on the Rue Garrett, at a table outside on the cobblestones. Evelyn ordered in careful halting Portuguese that she had been practicing on her phone for 3 weeks, and the young waiter responded with such genuine delight at her effort that she beamed for 20 minutes afterward. We shared a plate of pastries and drank strong coffee, and watched the city wake up around us, trams grinding past on iron rails, shopkeepers rolling up their metal shutters, a pair of pigeons investigating an abandoned bread crust near the fountain across the street. "I want to come back," Evelyn said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "When we're old." "We are old," I pointed out. "Older then. I want to come back when we're older and sit at this exact table and order the exact same thing." She looked at me with those dark eyes that had not changed in 40 years, not in the way that mattered. "Promise me." "I promise you," I said. She smiled and reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. That was the last peaceful moment I remember. Because when she stood up to go back inside for a moment, her hand went to her chest. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies with gasping and stumbling. Just a quiet pressing of her palm flat against her sternum, and then a look on her face that I had never seen before, confused, almost apologetic, as though her own body had done something she had not authorized. "Walter," she said very quietly, and then her knees buckled. The coffee cup hit the cobblestones and shattered, and I was around the table before the sound had finished echoing. The waiter reached us first. He was the same young man who had laughed so warmly at Evelyn's Portuguese 20 minutes before, and now he was on his knees beside her on the cobblestones, speaking rapidly into his phone while I held my wife's head in my lap and told her things I was not sure were true. "You're fine," I said. "Evelyn, stay with me. You're going to be fine." Her eyes were open, but they had gone somewhere distant, focused on a point above my head that I could not locate. Her breathing was shallow and quick, too quick, and the hand I pressed against her cheek was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air. The ambulance arrived in 4 minutes. I know because I counted. When you have nothing useful to do, you count. You measure the seconds, because measuring them feels like doing something, and doing something feels like you still have some control over what is happening, even when you do not. The paramedics moved with the efficient calm of people who have seen fear on other people's faces so many times, it no longer registers as remarkable. They spoke to each other in Portuguese and to me in careful accented English, asking questions I answered without fully hearing myself answer. Her name, her age, any known allergies, any medications. When did this start? Did she lose consciousness? Has this happened before? No, I kept saying, no, no, no. In the ambulance, I sat pressed against the wall to stay out of the way and watched them work over my wife with the helpless, hollow feeling of a man who has spent his whole life being useful and has suddenly run out of ways to be. I had built things with my hands for 40 years, furniture home additions, the back porch, where Evelyn drank her morning coffee every summer. I had fixed engines and argued contracts and raised a son. And right now, I could not do a single thing except stay out of the way and not fall apart before we reached the hospital. Hospital de Luz was 20 minutes from the Alfama district. I know because I counted those minutes too. The emergency bay received us with sliding glass doors and fluorescent lights, and the particular controlled chaos of a place where urgency is the ordinary condition. A nurse took over from the paramedics with a smooth efficiency that I found strangely comforting. Someone pressed a clipboard into my hands. Someone else guided me to a row of chairs against the wall and told me in English that was better than my Portuguese would ever be, that the doctors were with my wife, and I should wait here and someone would come to update me shortly. I sat down. The clipboard had forms on it. I filled them out because it gave my hands something to do. Name, date of birth, insurance information, emergency contact. I wrote Nathaniel's name in the emergency contact field out of pure muscle memory, the way you reach for a phone to call someone, and then remember halfway through dialing that they are gone. I stared at what I had written for a long moment, then crossed it out and wrote my brother Dennis instead. 7 years, and my hand still reached for my son first. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and floor cleaner, and faintly of the coffee someone had left in a paper cup on the table by the window. I stared at that cup for a long time. Outside the window, Lisbon continued its morning without us, a delivery truck, backing into an alley across the street. A woman walking a small dog along the sidewalk, ordinary life proceeding in the ordinary way that ordinary life does, completely indifferent to the fact that mine had stopped. I prayed. I am not a man who prays easily or often, but I prayed then with the kind of stripped-down desperation that has no room for language or formality. Just the raw, wordless asking of a man who has already lost one person he could not afford to lose, begging whatever is listening not to take another. I had buried my son 7 years ago. I could not bury my wife. The thought cracked something open in my chest, and I pressed my fist against my sternum and breathed through it the way you breathe through physical pain, slowly, deliberately, one breath and then the next. Around me, other people waited with their own private catastrophes. A young mother with a sleeping toddler across her lap. An elderly man turning a hat over and over in his hands. A teenage boy staring at his phone with the fixed concentration of someone trying very hard not to think. We were all just people in chairs waiting to find out what came next. A nurse appeared at the door to the treatment area and said something in Portuguese. Then, catching my eye, she switched to English. "Mr. Reed, the doctor will see you now. Your wife is stable. You can come through." I stood up so fast the clipboard hit the floor. I did not stop to pick it up. The nurse led me through a set of double doors and down a short corridor that smelled more strongly of antiseptic past curtained bays and equipment carts, and a nurse's station where 2 women spoke in low voices over a computer screen. She stopped outside a closed door and said, "The doctor is just finishing his initial assessment. 1 moment, please," and knocked twice before pushing it open. I followed her in, and the world stopped. The man in the white coat standing at the foot of my wife's bed had his back to me reviewing something on a tablet. His dark hair curling slightly at the collar, his shoulders set with the particular straight-backed posture of someone who had learned to carry authority without thinking about it. I knew those shoulders. I knew the way he tilted his head when he was concentrating. I knew the shape of his hands. I had watched those hands learn to grip a baseball bat, learn to tie a Windsor knot, learn to hold a scalpel in the surgical rotation videos he used to make me watch whether I wanted to or not. My son turned around, and he looked at me the way a stranger looks at someone who has just walked into the wrong room. There is a photograph on the mantelpiece in our living room in Hartford that I have walked past every single day for 7 years. It was taken at Nathaniel's medical school graduation. He is wearing his cap and gown, standing between Evelyn and me, squinting slightly into the afternoon sun. He has his mother's cheekbones and my jaw and a smile that belongs entirely to himself, wide and unguarded, and a little crooked on the left side. Evelyn cried through the entire ceremony. I told her she was embarrassing our son. Nathaniel told me to let her cry, that she had earned it. I know that photograph the way I know my own reflection. Every line of it, every shadow. And the man standing at the foot of my wife's hospital bed was that photograph come to life. He was broader across the shoulders than I remembered. 7 years of adulthood had filled him out in ways I had never gotten to witness. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before. His hair was cut shorter on the sides, but the jaw was the same. The way he held his head was the same. The hands that set down the tablet and turned to face me were the same hands I had bandaged after Little League games and watched receive a diploma and clasped between both of mine at the airport the last time I saw him alive. "Mr. Reed," he said. His voice was the same. Lower, maybe more settled into itself, but the same. "I'm Dr. Nate Calloway. I've completed my initial assessment of your wife. Her vitals are stabilizing well." I could not speak. He took my silence for shock, which it was, though not the kind he assumed, and gestured toward the chair beside Evelyn's bed, with the practiced calm of a man accustomed to delivering difficult news in small, manageable doses. "Please sit down. I know this has been frightening. Your wife is in good hands." "Nathaniel," I said. The name came out of me without permission. Raw and cracked and desperate, the way things come out of you when you have held them in for 7 years, and your body simply decides it will not hold them 1 second longer. He stopped. Looked at me with a small, polite frown. "I'm sorry, Nathaniel." I took 1 step toward him, then another, my legs moving before my brain had fully authorized the action. "Nathaniel Thomas Reed, you were born on March 14, 1988 at St. Francis Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. Your mother cried for 2 hours before you arrived because she was convinced she was going to be terrible at this. You weighed 8 pounds and 2 ounces, and you came out already furious about something. And the first thing I said when I held you was, 'God help me,' I said. Well, he's got my ears." Something moved across his face. Not recognition, not the sudden flooding return of memory that I had prayed for in the 2 seconds between seeing him and speaking his name. Just confusion. Careful, professional confusion with something uncertain flickering beneath it. "Sir," he said, and his voice was gentle in the way that doctors learn to be gentle when they are dealing with people who are not entirely in control of themselves. "I think you may be confusing me with someone else. My name is Nate Calloway. I've worked at this hospital for 3 years. I don't know anyone named Nathaniel Reed." "You are Nathaniel Reed," I said. My voice broke on the last word. I was not ashamed of it. "You are my son." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn, who had turned her head on the pillow, and was watching us both with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between terror and a hope so fragile she seemed afraid to breathe on it. "I had an accident," he said finally, slowly, as though he was explaining something to someone who needed it, explained simply. "Several years ago, a serious head injury. I have significant gaps in my memory from before that time. I was told I had no family." He paused. "I'm sorry. I genuinely don't know who you are." The words hit me the way cold water hits you all at once everywhere, leaving you gasping. He was alive. My son was standing 4 feet away from me in a white coat, with a stethoscope around his neck, and he was alive. He had been alive. He had been alive this whole time, while Evelyn and I sat in our living room in Hartford and looked at that photograph on the mantelpiece and tried to remember how to breathe without him. And he did not know my face. "Nathaniel." Evelyn's voice came from the bed, barely above a whisper, and it broke on his name the way mine had. "Baby, it's Mom." He turned to look at her. And for just a moment, just 1 fractured second, something crossed his face that I cannot fully describe. Not memory. Something older than memory. something that lives in the body rather than the mind, in the place where 7 years of forgetting cannot reach. Then it was gone. "Mrs. Reed," he said carefully, "I need you to stay calm. Your blood pressure is still elevated, and emotional distress can—" "Look at me," she said. Tears were streaming down her face into her hair, but her voice was steady. "Just look at me and tell me you don't know me. Look me in the eye and tell me." He looked at her. His jaw tightened. His hand moved to the railing at the foot of her bed and gripped it, and I watched his knuckles go white, and I thought, he feels it. Whatever she is to him, whatever I am to him, something in him feels it, even if his mind cannot name it. "I'll give you a few minutes," he said quietly, "and then I need to finish my examination." He walked out. I crossed the room in 3 steps and took Evelyn's hand in both of mine, and she gripped me back so hard it hurt, and neither of us cared, even slightly. "Walter," she breathed. "Walter, that's our boy." "I know," I said. "I know it is. He's alive." Her voice collapsed entirely on the last word. "He's been alive." I pressed her hand against my chest and held it there over my heart so she could feel it pounding. "Yes, yes," I said. "He has." A nurse came in 20 minutes later and asked me very kindly to wait outside while they completed Evelyn's examination. I did not want to leave. Every instinct I had said, stay in this room, stay where you can see both of them. Because the last time you turned your back on someone you loved, they disappeared for 7 years. But Evelyn squeezed my hand and said, "Go." "I'm not going anywhere, Walter. I promise." And because she had kept every promise she had ever made me in 40 years, I went. The hallway outside was long and white and smelled of floor cleaner and something faintly floral that I suspected came from a diffuser plugged in near the nurse's station. I found a chair against the wall between a water fountain and a cart of folded linens, and I sat down, and I put my face in my hands. I stayed like that for a long time. And then the memories came. Not gradually, not gently. They came the way floodwater comes when a dam gives way all at once, and with tremendous force. And I was back in November of 2017, standing in the kitchen of our house in Hartford in my pajamas at 2 in the morning, reaching for the phone that would not stop ringing. It had been Serena's voice on the other end. Even now, sitting in this hospital hallway in Lisbon, I could reconstruct every syllable of what she said. She had been crying, or something that sounded exactly like crying, which I understand now is not the same thing at all. Her voice had that particular fractured quality of someone struggling to push words past genuine grief. "Walter," she said. "Walter, something happened. There was an accident on 95. Nathaniel," her voice broke cleanly on his name, the way a branch breaks sudden and complete. "Nathaniel didn't make it." 4 words, didn't make it. I had stood in our kitchen, holding the phone against my ear, and I had felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. And I had thought with the strange clarity that sometimes comes in the first moments of catastrophic news that I needed to sit down before I fell down. I had pulled out a chair from the kitchen table and sat in it, and stared at the salt shaker in the center of the table, an ugly ceramic rooster that Evelyn had bought at a garage sale in 2004, and that I had been mildly complaining about for 13 years, and I had thought, I need to go upstairs and tell Evelyn. I need to go upstairs and tell my wife that our son is dead. I did not move for 11 minutes. The funeral had been a closed casket. Serena had explained this with enormous gentleness. Her eyes red and swollen, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug in our living room 3 days after the accident. The damage from the collision was significant, she told us. The medical examiner had advised against an open viewing, She had already handled the arrangements, the funeral home, the death certificate, the notice in the Hartford Courant. She had wanted to spare us the details. She had wanted to protect us. She had been so thoughtful. Every person who came through our door in those days said some version of the same thing. What a remarkable young woman. What a devoted wife. To lose her husband so young and still find the strength to take care of everyone around her. Evelyn's sister Margaret said Serena was a saint. Our neighbor Don, who had known Nathaniel since he was 10 years old, shook Serena's hand with both of his and told her Nathaniel would have been proud. I had believed all of it. That was the thing I could not get past sitting in that hallway in Lisbon with my face in my hands. I had believed every word of it. I had stood at my son's graveside, an empty grave, I now understood, holding nothing but the weight of what Serena had constructed, and I had wept, and I had held my wife while she wept, and I had let Serena take my arm and guide me back to the car because I was too devastated to manage the walk alone. She had guided me. She had held my arm. After the funeral, she had stayed. Of course she had stayed. She was family. She was grieving. Where else would she go? She moved into Nathaniel's old room and cooked meals and answered the door when neighbors came with casseroles and handled the phone calls I could not bring myself to make. She was by every observable measure exactly what she appeared to be, a young woman who had lost her husband and was holding herself together by taking care of the people around her. 7 years. For 7 years, Evelyn had kept a candle on the windowsill of Nathaniel's old bedroom. She lit it every night at dusk and let it burn until she went to sleep. She never explained why. She did not need to. It was the kind of thing you do when the grief is too large for any gesture that fits inside normal life, so you find a small one instead, and you repeat it until it becomes a kind of prayer. 7 years of candles burning in that window, and on the other side of the world in this city full of red rooftops and river light. Our son had been waking up every morning and going to work and saving other people's lives. The door at the end of the hallway opened. Nathaniel stepped out, tablet in hand, and started walking in the direction of the nurse's station. He had not seen me yet. I watched him move that particular walk, that slight forward lean he had always had, like he was always arriving somewhere slightly ahead of schedule, and something in my chest cracked wide open. He looked up and saw me sitting against the wall. He stopped walking. We looked at each other across the length of that corridor, and something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, not yet, but something troubled and searching. Like a man trying to remember a word that is sitting right on the edge of his tongue. "Have we met before?" he said slowly. "I keep feeling like I know you from somewhere." I had approximately 3 seconds to decide what to do. 3 seconds standing in that hospital hallway with my son looking at me from 15 feet away. His head tilted at that angle I had known since he was 4 years old, waiting for an answer to a question that contained more truth than he understood. I could tell him everything. Right there, right then, in the corridor of a Portuguese hospital, while my wife lay in a room behind me with an IV in her arm. I could say, yes, we have met. We have met every day of your life for 33 years. I am your father. Your name is not Nate Calloway. Your name is Nathaniel Thomas Reed, and you grew up in a greenhouse on Birchwood Lane in Hartford, Connecticut, and your mother has been lighting a candle for you every single night for 7 years. I could say all of that. And then what he would think I was a grieving old man who had lost his mind along with his son. He would call someone to come manage me. He would step back behind the professional distance that doctors learn to maintain with difficult family members, and whatever fragile thread of instinct had just made him stop and ask me that question would snap completely. "I don't think so," I said. "I'm sorry. I think you just remind me of someone." Something flickered across his face. Disappointment almost. as though my answer had closed a door he had been hoping to open. He nodded slowly and looked down at the tablet in his hands, and I watched him decide whether to walk away, and I held my breath. He did not walk away. Instead, he crossed the hallway and sat down in the empty chair beside me. Not the chair directly next to mine, but the one with one seat between us. The careful distance of a man who has learned to be considerate of other people's space. He set the tablet on his knee and looked at the wall across from us for a moment. Your wife is doing well," he said. "Her blood pressure is responding to the medication. The allergic reaction to the shellfish triggered a vasovagal episode. Essentially, her nervous system's response to the physical stress caused a temporary drop in blood pressure and loss of muscle control. It looked more dramatic than it was. She should be ready for discharge by tomorrow morning, provided her numbers stay stable overnight." Vasovagal episode. I filed the term away carefully. In America, when you leave a hospital, they send you home with papers that explain everything in language designed for people who did not go to medical school. Here, I had my son sitting next to me explaining it in plain English, and I could not tell him that I already trusted him completely, that I had trusted him before he opened his mouth, because I had watched him learn to be trustworthy over 33 years. "Thank you," I said, "for taking care of her. It's what I'm here for." He paused. "Are you from the States, your accent?" "Connecticut," I said. "We've been married 40 years. This trip we wanted to do something to mark it." 40 years. He said it with a quiet kind of weight, like he was testing how the number felt. "That's remarkable. It doesn't feel like 40 years, I told him honestly. "It feels like last Tuesday." That made him smile. It was the smile from the photograph on the mantelpiece, wide and unguarded and crooked on the left side, and it hit me in the sternum like a closed fist. I kept my eyes on the wall across the hallway and breathed carefully through my nose. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "You said you had an accident, that you lost your memory." I kept my voice neutral, curious, the voice of a man making polite conversation with a doctor. "How long ago?" 7 years, he said. November of 2017. I was in Portland, Maine at the time, or at least that's where I woke up. I don't remember how I got there. He looked at his hands on the tablet. "I don't remember much of anything from before that point. Some fragments. Nothing I've been able to connect to a specific person or place." November of 2017. The same month. The same year. The month Serena had called me at 2 in the morning with that carefully fractured voice and told me my son was gone. I pressed my back teeth together and said nothing. "A doctor at the rehabilitation center took an interest in me," Nathaniel continued. "Raymond Prescott. He was the chief of neurology there, brilliant man, the kind who actually listened instead of just running through a checklist. He noticed that even without my memories, I still had certain instincts, I suppose you'd call them. Medical instincts. He said my hands knew things my brain had forgotten." He paused. "He helped me study for my boards. Helped me get certified internationally. When a position opened up here in Lisbon through an exchange program he had connections with, he made a call on my behalf. That was 3 years ago. He sounds like a good man," I said. "The best I've ever known." He said it simply and without hesitation, and I felt a complicated knot of emotion tighten in my chest. Gratitude for Raymond Prescott and grief for myself because the best man my son had ever known was a stranger, and I was sitting right next to him, and he did not know my name. "Do you have family?" I asked. I already knew what he would say. I needed to hear him say it anyway. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, Not that I know of. I was told there was no one. After the accident, I was told there was no one. 4 words, and behind them Serena's careful hands arranging everything. Serena deciding who my son was allowed to know about. Serena standing in a hospital corridor in Portland, Maine 7 years ago, making choices that were never hers to make. I looked away from him, toward the window at the end of the hall. Outside, the morning had turned fully bright. The kind of clean Lisbon light that makes everything look like it was built specifically to be beautiful. I focused on a church tower in the middle distance and breathed until I was sure my voice would come out steady. "I'm glad you found good people," I said. He turned to look at me. Then really look at me, and I felt it again, that thing beneath the surface of his eyes, that wordless pulling towards something he could not identify. "Your hands," he said quietly. "They remind me of something. A feeling more than an image." He shook his head slightly. "I'm sorry. That probably sounds strange." "It doesn't sound strange at all," I said. Evelyn was asleep when I came back into the room. The medication had finally pulled her under. She was lying on her side with one hand curled beneath her cheek, the way she always slept at home, and the heart monitor beside her bed was making a slow, steady sound that I found more comforting than any words anyone had said to me all day. I pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down and held her free hand loosely in both of mine and watched her breathe. Outside the window, Lisbon had shifted into late afternoon. The light was going golden and long, the kind of light that turns ordinary buildings into something worth painting. I had been awake for 11 hours. I could not have slept if someone had paid me. My mind would not stop moving. I kept turning over the same small facts, arranging and rearranging them the way you work a splinter out of your finger. Probing the edges, testing the angles. Trying to find the approach that would make the whole thing finally come free. Nathaniel had his accident in November of 2017, Portland, Maine. That much he had told me himself, and Portland, Maine was where Serena had told us she was handling the arrangements. I had not thought about that in 7 years. There had been no reason to think about it. When your child dies, you do not interrogate the geography of their final hours. You do not sit down with a map and trace the route and ask why the hospital was there instead of here. You grieve. You hold your wife. You stand at a graveside and try to remember how to keep putting one foot in front of the other. But now I thought about it. Nathaniel had been living in Hartford when the accident happened. He and Serena had an apartment on Asylum Avenue, the top floor of a converted Victorian 12 minutes from our house, close enough that Evelyn could drop off food without calling ahead. If he had been in an accident on Interstate 95, the nearest trauma centers were in Hartford itself. Yale, New Haven was 40 minutes south. Boston was 2 hours north. Portland, Maine was 4 hours away. Why was my son in Portland, Maine on a November night in 2017? And why had Serena never explained that? Why had I never asked? I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until I saw white, because she had not given me room to ask. That was why. She had shown up at our door the morning after the phone call, with her eyes swollen and her hair unwashed, and a casserole dish from our neighbor Linda that she said Linda had dropped off, and she had sat at our kitchen table and cried while Evelyn held her, and there had been so much grief in that room, so much raw, suffocating grief, that there was simply no space for questions. Questions felt indecent. Questions felt like an accusation. You do not interrogate a widow. I thought about the hospital in Portland, whichever hospital it had been. I thought about the doctors who had worked on my son, who had brought him back from whatever edge he had been standing on, who had looked at his chart and reached for the phone to call his next of kin. And I thought, who did they call? Under federal law, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which every American who has ever filled out a medical form knows by its initials, a hospital cannot release a patient's information to anyone without that patient's written authorization or the authorization of their designated healthcare proxy. If Nathaniel had been admitted unconscious and without identification, the hospital would have worked from whatever emergency contact information they could find. His wallet, his phone if it survived the crash, insurance cards, all of which Serena would have had access to. She was his wife. She was his healthcare proxy by default under Connecticut law, the legal authority to make medical decisions on behalf of a spouse who cannot make them for themselves. She would have been the first person the hospital contacted. She would have been the only person whose instructions they were legally required to follow. And she could have told them calmly, efficiently, in that quiet, competent voice of hers, that made everyone around her feel like things were being handled. She could have told them that there was no other family, that she was the only one, that all communications regarding her husband should go through her and no one else. The hospital would have complied. They had no reason not to. She had used the law like a door and locked us out of it. Walter. Evelyn's voice was thick with sleep, barely above a murmur. Her fingers tightened around mine without her eyes opening. "I'm here," I said. "Have you eaten anything?" "No. You need to eat something." She turned her head on the pillow and looked at me with the eyes of a woman who has spent 40 years learning to read my face. Whatever she saw there made her own face change. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking about Portland," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then slowly she pushed herself up against the pillows, and I adjusted them behind her back, the way I had 10,000 times before, and she looked at me steadily and said, "Tell me all of it." So I did. I laid it out for her piece by piece, the geography, the timeline, the healthcare proxy, the neat legal architecture of how a person could be made to disappear from their own family with nothing more than a signature and a phone call. Evelyn listened without interrupting, the way she always listened when something mattered, with her whole body still and her eyes fixed on my face. When I finished, she said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached up and put her hand flat against my cheek, and I covered it with mine. And she said quietly, "She was there first, wasn't she? Before they called us. She was already there." "Yes," I said. "I think she was." "Walter." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "She has been in our home for 7 years. She has been sleeping in our son's room and eating at our table and—" She stopped, swallowed. Her hand pressed harder against my cheek. "How much does she know about the accounts?" The question landed in my chest like a stone. I thought about the savings account Evelyn and I had been building since 1991. $2.4 million set aside for retirement, 30 years of discipline and careful living. I thought about the house on Birchwood Lane, valued last year at $1.8 million. I thought about the way Serena had started asking with increasing frequency over the past 2 years whether we had updated our estate documents recently. Too much," I said. Evelyn closed her eyes. Outside, the Lisbon evening settled quietly over the rooftops, indifferent and beautiful. While inside this small white room, my wife and I sat with the full weight of 7 years of lies pressing down on us, and began very slowly to understand what we were dealing with. After Evelyn fell back asleep, I sat in the dark and let the memories come. I had spent 7 years trying not to think too carefully about the weeks after Nathaniel's funeral. Grief has a way of smoothing over the details. It blurs the edges of things, softens the sharp angles, makes the unbearable slightly more bearable by rendering it slightly less precise. I had accepted that blurring. I had been grateful for it. But sitting in that hospital room in Lisbon with my wife's hand in mine, and my son somewhere in this building not knowing my name. I needed the details back. I needed to look at what had actually happened clearly and without mercy and understand what I had been too destroyed to see at the time. The funeral had been on a Saturday. Serena had arranged everything. She had gone to the funeral home Whitmore and Sons on Farmington Avenue, the same place that had handled my father's service 20 years before, and she had made every decision herself: the flowers, the music, the order of the program. When I had offered to help, she had shaken her head gently and said that she needed to do this for him, that it was the last thing she could do for her husband, and she needed to do it right. I had respected that. Evelyn had held my hand and said we should let her have this. The casket was mahogany, closed. Serena had explained this at the kitchen table the morning of the service. Her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her voice steady in a way that seemed to cost her enormous effort. The accident had been severe, she told us. The medical examiner, she produced a document official looking with a county seal in the upper corner, had advised strongly against an open viewing. She had made the decision she felt was best. She hoped we understood. She hoped we could trust her. We trusted her. $85,000. That was what the funeral cost, according to the statement that arrived 6 weeks later from Whitmore and Sons. I remembered staring at that number and thinking it seemed high, and then feeling immediately ashamed of myself for thinking about money at a time like that. Serena had handled the payment directly from the joint account she and Nathaniel shared, which as his widow she had full legal access to under Connecticut probate law. She had shown me the statement when it arrived, walked me through every line item with quiet efficiency, and I had nodded and said it was fine. It was all fine, whatever she needed. Whatever she needed. At the reception afterward, held at our house because Serena said she could not bear to be in the apartment she had shared with Nathaniel, our living room, filled up with people saying versions of the same things people always say. He was so young. He had such a future ahead of him. At least he didn't suffer. You must be so proud of the doctor he became. And threading through all of it, woven through every conversation, was Serena moving from person to person, with her dark eyes full of tears and her voice breaking in exactly the right places, accepting condolences with a grace that made grown men look at the floor to collect themselves. Our neighbor Don had gripped her hand with both of his and said, "That boy loved you more than anything. You know that, don't you?" Serena had pressed her lips together and nodded, and 2 tears had tracked down her cheeks in perfect symmetry. And Dawn had looked at me over her shoulder with an expression that said, "What a remarkable woman." Evelyn's sister Margaret had called her a saint. Specifically, she had said, "I don't know how she's holding herself together. She's a Saint Walter. You are so lucky to have her." Lucky. I had been lucky to have her. She had moved into Nathaniel's old room that first week because she said the apartment held too many memories. She would find her own place. Soon, she told us. She just needed a little time. We had said, of course, stay as long as you need. You are family. You will always be family. And a little time had become a month, and a month had become 6 months, and 6 months had become 7 years. And somewhere in the slow accumulation of those years, we had simply stopped expecting her to leave. She cooked. She cleaned. She drove Evelyn to her cardiology appointments and waited in the lobby with a book and a cup of coffee, and remembered to ask the doctor the follow-up questions that Evelyn always forgot to ask. She organized our tax documents every April. She called the plumber when the basement flooded, and managed the contractor when we had the kitchen updated, and remembered every medication refill before we did. She was indispensable. That was the word people used. Indispensable. Friends would ask how we were managing, and we would say, "Well, we have Serena." And they would nod as though that explained everything, because it did. Serena was the answer to every question about how two people in their 60s were surviving the loss of their only child. She was the solution. She was the structure that kept us upright. And I had never once asked why she stayed. I had told myself it was grief. Mutual grief, the kind that bonds people together because they are the only ones who truly understand what has been lost. I had told myself that she stayed because we were all she had left of Nathaniel, just as she was all we had left of him. But sitting in the dark of a hospital room in Lisbon, with the monitor beeping steadily beside my sleeping wife, I thought about the estate documents Serena had asked about last spring. Casual, almost offhand, she had been helping me sort through some files, and she had held up a folder and said, "Walter, when did you last update your will? You really should have an attorney look at this." I had thanked her for the reminder. I had not made the appointment. Outside in the corridor, footsteps passed and faded. Somewhere deeper in the hospital, a phone rang twice and went quiet. I sat with my hands on my knees and stared at the floor and felt rising slowly through the grief and the shock and the exhaustion something harder and colder and more useful than any of those things. I felt anger. Not the hot explosive kind that burns itself out quickly. The cold kind. The kind that settles in and stays. Tomorrow I decided I would find my son again. And this time I would not walk away. I found him at 7:15 the next morning, standing at the nurse's station, with a paper cup of coffee and a patient chart, wearing the same quiet authority he had carried the day before, like a second skin. He looked up when I approached, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite surprise, but a kind of careful attention, the way a person looks at something they have been thinking about without meaning to. "Mr. Reed," he said, "how is your wife this morning?" "Sleeping," I said. "Which the nurse tells me is the best thing for her. I wanted to come find you. I wanted to say thank you properly, not just in the middle of an emergency." He set down the chart and gestured toward a pair of chairs near the window. At the end of the corridor, the same window I had stared out of the day before, watching Lisbon go about its business while my world rearranged itself entirely. We sat down and he wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, the way his mother always held hers, and I felt the observation land in my chest, like a small, precise wound. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Your wife was a straightforward case once we identified the trigger. The shellfish allergy combined with the heat and the physical exertion of the morning created a perfect storm, so to speak. Her heart is strong. She'll be fine." "I know," I said, "but I'm thanking you anyway." He accepted this with a small nod. We sat for a moment with the comfortable silence of two people who have already had one honest conversation and are deciding whether to have another. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You asked me that yesterday," he said, and there was a trace of something in his voice, warmth, almost the careful warmth of a man who does not give it away easily. I said yes then, too. "You mentioned Portland," I said. "The rehabilitation center. You said a doctor there took an interest in you. Raymond Prescott." The name came out of him differently than other words, with a weight and a steadiness that told me everything I needed to know about what this man had meant to my son. He was the chief of neurology at Harborview Rehabilitation Center in Portland. I was not an easy patient in the early months. I had no memory, no identification, no clear sense of who I was or where I had come from. That is not a condition that brings out the best in a person. He paused, looking at his coffee. I was angry a lot of the time. Frightened, though, I would not have called it that then. I would have called it frustrated. "That sounds reasonable," I said carefully, given the circumstances. "Dr. Prescott did not treat me like a problem to be managed," Nathaniel continued. That was the difference. The other staff were kind enough, but there was a protocol, and I was a deviation from it. and the goal was to get me back within the lines as efficiently as possible. Prescott sat with me. He asked me questions that had nothing to do with my medical chart. What did I dream about? What did my hands want to do when I was not thinking about what my hands were doing? What did they want to do? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Nathaniel looked at his own hands for a moment. Long-fingered, careful hands. His grandfather's hands, actually. My father had been a surgeon before arthritis took his career, and I had always thought it skipped a generation when Nathaniel went into medicine. They wanted to help, he said simply. I would watch the nurses do their rounds, and I would know without knowing how I knew what they were checking, and why, and what they should do differently if a reading came back wrong. Prescott noticed. He started bringing me along on his morning rounds unofficially just to see. A quiet exhale. He said I had a gift that belonged in a hospital, and he was not going to let a head injury bury it. My throat tightened so severely that I had to look away for a moment. I fixed my gaze on a point past his shoulder and breathed through it. He sounds like a remarkable man, I said. He paid for my board examinations out of his own pocket, Nathaniel said. When I passed, and I almost did not pass the first time, my medical Spanish was terrible, and I had to retake one section. He took me to dinner at this terrible diner near the hospital that he loved for reasons I never fully understood, and he ordered the patty melt and the cherry pie. And he said, "Nate, you are going to be one of the finest physicians I have ever trained, and I want you to promise me something." I turned back to look at my son. What did he ask you to promise? He asked me to promise that I would never stop looking. Nathaniel's voice was quiet. He said the memories might come back or they might not, but that did not mean I should stop looking for the life I came from. He said everyone comes from somewhere. Everyone belongs to someone. He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly. I have not been very good at keeping that promise. The words fell between us and stayed there. I wanted to grab his arm. I wanted to say, "You belong to me. You belong to a woman in a room down this hall who has been lighting a candle in your window every night for 7 years. You belong to a greenhouse on Birchwood Lane with a back porch and a broken gutter on the north side that I have been meaning to fix since 2015. Instead, I said, "You're keeping it right now by talking to me." He looked at me with an expression I recognized from 33 years of watching this face, the particular look of a man who wants to believe something but is not sure he has earned the right to yet. And then it happened. He pressed 2 fingers to his left temple, and his brow furrowed sharply, and he drew in a breath through his teeth. "Are you all right?" I was half out of my chair before I finished the sentence. "Headache," he said, his voice tighter than before. "I've been getting them since yesterday." Since. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and something moved in their depths that I had not seen before. Something that was not confusion. Something that was almost the opposite of confusion. "Since I met you," he finished quietly. "Does that happen often?" I asked. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Never," he said. "Not like this." He lowered his hand slowly. His eyes stayed on my face with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. "What is your first name, Mr. Reed?" "Walter," I said. He repeated it not to me but to himself, testing it the way you test the temperature of water before you step into it. "Walter," he said again. And his voice, for just a fraction of a second, cracked down the middle like old wood giving way. I walked back to Evelyn's room with my hands in my pockets and my chest full of something I did not have the clean word for. It was not hope, exactly. Hope implies uncertainty, And what I had felt in those last seconds with Nathaniel watching his voice break on my name, watching something ancient and wordless move behind his eyes, did not feel uncertain. It felt like watching a locked door begin very slowly to open, which was its own kind of terrifying because I did not yet know what was on the other side. And I had learned in the past 24 hours that the things you do not know can be considerably worse than the things you do. Evelyn was awake, sitting up against her pillows, with a breakfast tray across her lap that she had barely touched. She looked better than she had the night before. Some color had come back into her face, and her eyes were sharp in the way they always were when she had been lying still long enough for her mind to start running ahead of her body. She took one look at me and said, "Something happened." "He said my name," I told her. He repeated it twice. His voice, Evie, his voice cracked on it. She pressed her hand flat against her mouth. Her eyes went bright and wet immediately, the way they did when emotion caught her faster than she could manage it. She breathed through her nose for a moment, steadying herself, and then lowered her hand and said, "Sit down. Tell me everything." I sat and told her about Prescott, about the promise, about the headaches that had started the moment Nathaniel met me. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, turning her fork over and over in her fingers without looking at it. "The headaches are the memories trying to come back," she said. It was not a question. "That's what I think too. Then we don't have much time." She set the fork down on the tray with a small, decisive click. "Walter, while you were gone, I was thinking about the money." I had been thinking about the money too. I had been thinking about it since Evelyn asked her question the night before. How much does she know about the accounts? And I had not been able to stop. The numbers were not complicated. Our savings account held $2.4 million, 30 years of careful living, of taking the vacation we could afford. Instead of the one we wanted of driving cars until the wheels fell off, of putting away every spare dollar because we had seen what happened to people who did not. The house on Birchwood Lane had been appraised 14 months ago at $1.8 million. Together $4.2 million in assets accumulated over a lifetime. Nathaniel had been our only child. Under Connecticut's intestate succession laws, the rules that govern how a person's estate is distributed when they die, without a clearly updated will, a surviving spouse inherits the majority of the estate. If both spouses are deceased and there are no surviving children, the estate passes to other relatives in a specific legal order. But if a daughter-in-law could establish herself as the primary caregiver, the most essential person in the lives of two aging parents who had no other family nearby, and if she could position herself favorably in a will that had not been reviewed since 2009, she asked about the will again in March. Evelyn said, "You were at Dennis's birthday dinner." She came into the kitchen while I was cleaning up, and she said very casually that she had been reading an article about estate planning for people over 60, and she thought we really ought to have an attorney look at our documents. She asked me in April, I said. When she was helping me sort through the filing cabinet, she held up the folder and said our will was 15 years old, and that was practically an invitation to complications. Evelyn looked at me steadily. She asked both of us, separately, within a month of each other. Yes. And neither of us mentioned it to the other. The implication settled between us like something heavy set down on a table. "She's been doing that," I said slowly. "Hasn't she? Having separate conversations with each of us. So we never compare notes." Evelyn nodded, and I watched her put it together in real time, the way her expression shifted from recognition to something colder and more precise. "The doctor," she said. "My cardiologist. Last year when I had the irregular reading, and Dr. Heller wanted me to come in for a follow-up. Serena scheduled it. I assumed she told you." "She told me it had been rescheduled," I said. that Dr. Heller's office had called and moved it to the following month. I never got a call from Dr. Heller's office, Evelyn said. I went in 2 weeks late because Serena told me it had been rescheduled. I thought it was odd at the time, but I assumed I had missed something. The silence that followed was the particular silence of two people adding things up and arriving at a sum neither of them wanted. Hi, she delayed your cardiology appointment, I said. She has been managing our schedules, controlling what information we each receive, keeping us slightly off balance, slightly dependent. I stopped, pressed my palms flat on my knees. That is not grief, Evelyn. That is not a woman who stayed because she loved our son and could not bear to leave the people who loved him too. No, Evelyn agreed quietly. It is not. She stayed because $4.2 million does not transfer itself. My voice came out harder than I intended. She has been patient. 7 years of patience. 7 years of cooking our meals and refilling our prescriptions and asking about our will with that gentle, concerned voice, and all of it, every single bit of it, has been about making sure that when we are gone, there is no one left to contest where the money goes. Evelyn reached across the breakfast tray and covered my hand with hers. Her grip was firm and warm and steadying the grip of a woman who had not survived 63 years by falling apart when things were hard. Then we need to make sure, she said, that we are not gone. She said it simply without drama, the way she said most important things. And sitting there in the morning light, coming through a hospital window in Lisbon, I felt something shift inside me, the grief and the shock and the exhaustion reorganizing themselves around something harder and more determined. I'm going to go back to him, I said. Today, I'm going to find a way to tell him the truth. Ah, good, said Evelyn. She picked up her fork and finally took a bite of her breakfast. But eat something first, Walter. You are no use to our son if you faint in the hallway. Before I reveal what Walter discovered about Serena and the truth behind Nathaniel's disappearance comment. If you're still here following this story, I truly appreciate you watching with us. And please note this story contains fictional elements created for entertainment and educational purposes. Some details may be changed, but the message behind it remains meaningful. The hospital discharged Evelyn the following afternoon. We took a taxi back to the hotel, and I helped her up to the room, and she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me with that particular expression she reserves for moments when she thinks I am about to do something she needs to talk me out of. You are going back to the hospital, she said. In an hour, I told her. I need you settled first. I am settled. I have been settled since 1984. She pointed at the door. Go. And Walter, be careful what you say. He is not ready for all of it yet. You will know when he is. She was right, of course. She was almost always right about things that involved other people's emotional thresholds, which was one of approximately 10,000 reasons I had married her. I walked back to Hôpital de Luz alone, through streets that smelled of bread and diesel and the faint salt undertow of the river. It was late afternoon by then, the light going amber over the rooftops, and I had the strange sensation of moving through a beautiful city while carrying something so heavy inside me that I was surprised it did not show on my face. Nathaniel was not on the floor when I arrived. The nurse at the station told me Dr. Calloway had finished his shift at 3 and would not be back until 7 the following morning. I stood at the window at the end of the corridor for a long time, looking out at the evening, and then I walked back to the hotel and sat in the chair by the window in our room while Evelyn slept, and I let my mind go where it had been trying to go all day. I thought about Dennis. My brother is 4 years younger than me, 61, now living in Glastonbury, 18 miles from Birchwood Lane. We had been close our entire lives in the uncomplicated way of brothers who have never had a serious falling out, which is to say we called each other every Sunday and met for lunch every few weeks, and did not require much from each other beyond basic loyalty and the occasional loan of a power tool. And then, approximately 2 years after Nathaniel's funeral, we had stopped calling each other every Sunday. I had noticed the distance growing, but I had attributed it to grief, to the way loss can make everything slightly harder, including the relationships that should be easiest. Dennis had tried to call me several times in that period. Actually, I remembered now, with the clarity of a man seeing something familiar from a new angle, that Dennis had called, and I had not called back. And when I finally did, he had been cooler than usual, and I had thought he was giving me space rather than asking for an explanation. But I had not stopped calling Dennis. Serena had told me he called. I pressed that thought down and examined it carefully. During that second year, Serena had begun handling the phone more often than not. I was sleeping poorly, she said, and she did not want me disturbed by calls during my rest. She had taken to telling me who had called and giving me messages that I trusted without verifying, because I was 61 years old and exhausted, and I trusted the person delivering them. She had told me twice that Dennis had called and asked when we were thinking about selling the house. I had been hurt by that. I had thought my brother of all people was already circling the estate. I had let the hurt calcify into a distance I never examined, because examining it would have required a conversation with Dennis about money, and I had not had the energy for it. And Dennis on his end must have thought I was the one pulling away. Because that is what grief looks like from the outside: withdrawal, silence, the failure to return calls. She had not invented the estrangement. She had simply placed one fabricated conversation between two grieving men and let human nature do the rest. That was the afternoon I remembered the letter. It had been a Thursday in November of 2019, exactly 2 years after the accident. I had come home from the grocery store to find Serena standing at the kitchen stove, and there had been a smell in the room that I had registered and dismissed at the time as something she had been cooking. But it was not a cooking smell, I understood now. It was the particular smell of paper burning thin and acrid, gone almost before you could name it. I had asked what she was burning. She had turned from the stove with a small, easy smile and said she was clearing out some old mail that had piled up junk. Mostly she would take care of it. Her voice had been perfectly level. Her hands, when she turned back to the stove, had been perfectly still. I had put away the groceries and thought nothing more of it. A letter had arrived at our address on Birchwood Lane. A letter with no return address, the handwriting on the envelope unfamiliar, because it belonged to a man reconstructing himself from nothing in a rehabilitation center in Portland, Maine. A man who had dreamed of a house and a kitchen, and a man reading the newspaper by the window and had found in some half-remembered corner of his damaged mind an address. My son had tried to come home. He had found a thread leading back, and he had reached for it, and written it down, and sealed it in an envelope, and sent it out into the world, not knowing exactly what he was sending it toward, only knowing that something in him said, "This is where you came from. Try." And Serena had taken that letter from the mailbox before I ever saw it. She had read my son's handwriting on an envelope. She had opened it or not opened it, it did not matter which, and she had carried it to the kitchen stove and she had burned it. She had stood there and watched it turn to ash, and then she had smiled at me when I walked in and told me it was junk mail. I sat in the chair by the hotel window with my hands clenched on my knees, and I breathed through what that knowledge felt like in my body. The heat of it, the sheer volcanic pressure of it rising from somewhere below my ribs. And I did not allow myself to make a sound, because Evelyn was sleeping 6 feet away, and she needed her rest. My phone lit up on the nightstand, a number I did not recognize, a Lisbon area code. I picked it up before the second ring and pressed it to my ear. "Mr. Reed." The voice on the other end was tight and slightly breathless. nothing like the measured, professional tone I had heard over the past 2 days. "It's Nate Calloway. I need to talk to you. Something is happening. I keep seeing things when I close my eyes. A kitchen, a newspaper, a window with morning light coming through it, a pause ragged at the edges, and a man's hands, folding the paper in half, the same way every Sunday. Is that Mr. Reed? Is that you?" My hand was shaking so hard I had to grip the phone with both of them. "Yes," I said. "That's me, Nathaniel. That is me." I did not wake Evelyn. I left a note on the nightstand, "Gone to the hospital, back soon, do not worry," which she would ignore completely, but which I felt obligated to write anyway. And I walked out into the Lisbon night, with my jacket half-buttoned and my heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to get out. The streets were quieter at this hour, but not empty. Couples moved along the sidewalks arm in arm. A group of young people spilled out of a restaurant doorway in a burst of laughter and cigarette smoke. A tram ground past on its iron rails, lit up orange against the dark, its handful of passengers visible through the windows like figures in a moving painting. I walked through all of it without seeing any of it, my feet finding the route to the hospital by some combination of memory and urgency that bypassed conscious thought entirely. Nathaniel was waiting for me outside the main entrance. He was sitting on a low stone wall to the left of the sliding doors. Still in his street clothes, he had not gone home after his shift, apparently, or had come back with his elbows on his knees and his head down, his hands pressed flat together between them, the way a man prays when he has forgotten the words. When he heard my footsteps, he looked up, and even in the inadequate light of the entrance awning, I could see that his face was different. Something had broken open in it. The professional composure, the careful distance, all of it was gone, and what was underneath was raw and young and frightened in a way that made him look, just for a moment, exactly like the boy I had put on a school bus for the first time 30 years ago. "I called Dr. Prescott," he said immediately before I could speak. "I called him an hour ago. I told him what was happening, the headaches, the images, all of it. He said," his voice caught. He pressed his lips together and started again. He said, "This is what it sometimes looks like, when the memories begin to come back." He said I should not fight it. He said to let it happen. "Then let it happen," I said. I sat down on the wall beside him, close enough that our shoulders were almost touching. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." He nodded once tightly and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. What happened next is difficult to describe, precisely because I experienced it entirely from the outside, watching my son's body process something his mind had kept sealed for 7 years. His breathing changed, deepened, slowed, then caught sharply, as though something had snagged it. His hands dropped from his face. His head came up. He stared at the middle distance with an expression of almost painful concentration, the way a person looks when they are listening to a sound just below the threshold of normal hearing. "The kitchen," he said quietly. "Yellow walls. There's a clock above the stove. It runs 3 minutes fast, and nobody ever fixes it. There's a hook by the back door where the dog leash used to hang even after the dog died. Because nobody wanted to take it down." "Biscuit," I said. My voice came out barely above a whisper. "Our dog's name was Biscuit. He died in 2012. Nathaniel turned to look at me. His eyes were wet. "I was there when he died," he said. "I drove home from my residency program. It was a Saturday. You were going to take him to the vet alone, and I told you I was coming, and you said you didn't have to, and I said—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I said he was my dog too, that I had grown up with him, that I wasn't going to let you do it alone." The back of my throat closed completely. I pressed my fist against my mouth and held it there. "Okay, you held him," Nathaniel said. "You held him the whole time and you talked to him. You told him he was the best dog you had ever had and that he had been a very good boy." His voice broke entirely on the last three words, split clean down the middle, and he bent forward with his elbows on his knees and pressed both hands over his face, and the sound that came out of him was not a word at all. It was the sound of 7 years of not knowing compressed into a single moment of knowing, and it was one of the most devastating things I have ever heard from another human being. I put my hand on his back. He flinched at the touch, just slightly, just the automatic response of a body not used to being touched in this particular way by this particular hand. And then he went still, and then slowly, like a building that has been standing in a high wind for a very long time and has finally decided it can stop bracing. He leaned into it. We sat like that for what might have been 2 minutes or 20. The tram went past again. The couples walked by. The city continued indifferent and beautiful. Then Nathaniel straightened. He wiped his face with the back of his hand in one rough, practical gesture that was mine, that was my gesture. I had done that exact thing 10,000 times, and watching him do it tore something loose in my chest that I was not sure would ever reattach properly. He looked at me, not with the polite professional attention of the past 2 days, not with the careful distance of a man who has learned to hold the world at arm's length for self-protection. He looked at me the way you look at someone you have known your entire life and lost and found again and cannot yet fully believe is real. "Dad," he said. One word. I had been holding myself together through 2 days of hospitals and revelations and grief, so compressed it had no room to move. And that one word undid all of it. I pulled my son into my arms, this man who was my boy, this doctor who had learned to walk again without me, and I held on with both hands, and I did not let go for a very long time. "I'm here." I told him the same way I had told him 1,000 times before in the dark of his bedroom when he was small and frightened and called out for me. "I'm right here, Nathaniel. I've got you." Against my shoulder I felt him nod, and then his voice muffled and unsteady. "Dad, I remember the night of the accident. I remember everything, and I have to tell you something about Serena." We moved inside. Not to the emergency department, not to any official part of the hospital. Nathaniel led me to a small staff lounge on the 2nd floor, a narrow room with a coffee maker and a round table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out over the back parking lot. Fluorescent light linoleum floor, the particular institutional quiet of a building that never fully sleeps. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the counter without asking whether I wanted any, which was such an ordinary and unconscious act of care that I had to look away for a moment while he did it. We sat across from each other at the table. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the surface of the coffee for a long time before he spoke. When he did, his voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been made steady deliberately by effort, the way you hold a door shut against wind. "The night of the accident," he said, "I found her phone." He had come home early from the hospital where he was finishing his residency, a scheduling change, and attending who had covered his last 2 hours. Serena had not been expecting him. She was in the kitchen, and her phone was on the counter beside the stove, and it lit up with a message while he was standing 6 feet away, and he saw the name on the screen before she did. "Marcus Holt." "I knew who he was," Nathaniel said. "He worked in hospital administration." She had mentioned him a few times, always casually, always as just a colleague. I had no reason to think anything of it. He stopped. Until I saw the message. He had not meant to read it. He had glanced at the screen the way you glance at anything that lights up in your peripheral vision, automatic and without intention. But the words were there before he could look away, and the words were not the words of a colleague. He had picked up the phone. Serena had turned from the stove and seen him holding it, and the expression on her face in that moment. He said he would never forget it. Not the guilt, not the fear, but the calculation. The instant, precise calculation of a person determining how bad the situation was and what the most efficient response would be. She tried to take the phone back, Nathaniel said. I stepped back. I read the whole conversation. 3 months of messages. His jaw tightened until the muscle along it stood out clearly. 3 months. While I was doing 12-hour shifts and coming home to her dinners and talking to her about our plans, she was sending him photographs and telling him she loved him and making plans of her own that had nothing to do with me. I did not speak. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. I took screenshots, he said. My hands were shaking so badly I had to do it 3 times to get them right. I put the phone down on the counter and I told her I was going to my parents' house. He looked up at me directly for the first time since he had started speaking. I told her I was coming to tell you, that I needed to tell you in person what I had found, because I did not trust myself to explain it over the phone and because... He stopped, swallowed. Because you were the person I went to when things were bad. That was just always true. You were the person I went to. Something cracked open in the middle of my chest and stayed open. She screamed at me, he continued. She told me if I walked out that door, I was destroying everything we had built. I told her what we had built was built on something rotten, and I was done standing on top of it. I got in the car. A long pause. I was driving too fast. I knew I was driving too fast. The rain was heavy and the road was dark, and I kept seeing those messages in my head. The photographs, her telling him, I kept seeing it. And I could not make myself slow down, because slowing down felt like giving her something, and I was not ready to give her anything. Interstate 95 northbound. A November night in 2017. Rain so heavy, the windshield wipers could not keep up with it. There was a truck, Nathaniel said quietly. It came over from the left lane. I do not know if the driver fell asleep or lost control or simply did not see me. I had maybe half a second of headlights before he stopped, set his coffee cup down very carefully on the table. And then nothing. For a very long time, nothing. The fluorescent light hummed above us. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. When I woke up, I did not know my name, he said. I did not know where I was. There was a woman sitting beside the bed, and she was holding my hand and crying, and she told me I had been in an accident, and that I was safe, and I had no way to evaluate whether that was true, because I had nothing to measure it against. His voice dropped. She told me my family was gone, that my parents had died years before, that there was no one else. And I believed her because I had nothing at all, to hold up against what she was telling me. She was all the information I had about who I was. I pressed both fists flat on the table in front of me and stared at them. She sat with you, I said. My voice came out strange, flattened by the effort of keeping it even. She held your hand, and she told you we were dead. Yes. While your mother and I were sitting in our living room in Hartford looking at your photograph on the mantelpiece. Yes. The word landed in the room and did not move. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth slowly and deliberately, the way you breathe when you are choosing not to do something you very much want to do. And I thought about Serena in our kitchen on a Thursday in November of 2019, turning from the stove with an easy smile and telling me it was junk mail. Dad. Nathaniel's voice was careful now, watching me. I know what you are feeling right now. I need you to hear me. We cannot go at her directly. If she finds out, we know if she feels cornered, she will move. She will protect herself. She has been doing this for 7 years, and she is very good at it. I looked at my son, this man who had learned to rebuild himself from nothing, who had made himself into something extraordinary without a single memory to stand on, who was sitting across from me now in a hospital staff lounge in Lisbon, clear-eyed and steady thinking, 3 steps ahead of his own grief. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "I am suggesting," he said, "that we do this carefully, that we give her enough rope, and that when we pull it tight, we make sure there is no way for her to get loose." We walked to the hotel at midnight. I had not planned to bring him. That night I had thought we would need more time, that Evelyn would need warning, that there was a careful and considered way to arrange the first meeting between a mother and the son she had been lighting candles for every night for 7 years. But Nathaniel had stood up from the table in the staff lounge and said quietly and without drama that he wanted to see her. That he had been thinking about her face all evening, and he could not wait any longer. And I had looked at this man, my son, a doctor, someone who had rebuilt himself from nothing, and I had understood that he had earned the right to stop waiting. So we walked through the Lisbon night, side by side, not speaking much, our footsteps falling into the same rhythm on the cobblestones, without either of us trying to make them do that. I knocked on the hotel room door softly. A long pause. Then the sound of Evelyn moving, the particular shuffle of a woman who sleeps lightly and wakes completely. The door opened. She saw me first. Then she saw who was standing beside me. The sound she made was not a word. It was something older than words. A sound from somewhere below language, from the place in a mother's body that has never stopped listening for her child. She reached out both hands and took Nathaniel's face between them, and she looked at him the way you look at something you believed was gone forever and cannot yet trust your own eyes about. And then she pulled him toward her and held on with a fierceness that made him bend down to meet her, because she could not reach him otherwise. And I stood in the doorway of a hotel room in Lisbon and watched my wife hold our son for the first time in 7 years. And I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and looked at the ceiling and tried to remember how to breathe. We stayed like that for a long moment, the 3 of us in the small, warm space of the doorway. Then Evelyn pulled back, held Nathaniel at arm's length, looked at his face with her hands still on his shoulders, and said with the particular directness of a woman who has been waiting 7 years and has run entirely out of patience for anything less than the truth, "You need to eat something. You look thin. Come inside." Nathaniel made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice broke cleanly on the second word. "Hi, baby," she said. "Sit down." We sat around the small table by the window, the same table where Evelyn and I had eaten room service the night she was discharged from the hospital, which already felt like a different lifetime. Nathaniel sat across from us with his hands flat on the table, and I watched my wife study her son the way she had studied him his entire life, cataloging the changes, memorizing the new version of him the way she had memorized every previous version. "Tell me what you need," she said finally. "Not what happened. I know enough of what happened. Tell me what you need right now, tonight." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "I need to know that you're safe," he said. "Both of you. I need to know that she hasn't done anything to hurt you." "She's done plenty," Evelyn said calmly. "But we are here and we are fine, and she does not know that yet, which means we have an advantage we need to use carefully." That was how the plan began. Not with strategy documents or legal consultations, but with my wife sitting across from our son at a hotel room table in the middle of the night, cutting straight to the point the way she always had. We divided the work between us. Nathaniel would stay in Lisbon, make no contact with Serena, and begin collecting everything he could from the medical side. His original intake records from Harborview Rehabilitation Center, the transfer documentation that bore Serena's signature, the billing statements from those first 3 months that showed who had been paying for his care and from which account. Under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, a patient has the right to access their own medical records, and Nathaniel was the patient. What Serena had signed on his behalf when he was incapacitated was legally discoverable. I would go home. I would walk back into the house on Birchwood Lane, and I would smile at Serena and eat whatever she had cooked and answer her questions about the trip and give her absolutely nothing that suggested the world had changed. I would contact our attorney Daniel Marsh, who had handled our legal affairs for 20 years and whom I trusted completely. I would ask him to pull together everything related to our estate documents, and I would have a conversation with him that Serena would not know about. And I would begin to look carefully, quietly, without leaving fingerprints at our financial statements. "She'll be watching you," Nathaniel said. "She's been managing both of you for years. She knows your patterns. She'll notice if anything changes." "Then nothing will change," I said. "I have been a retired school teacher for 11 years. I am very good at looking like I am not doing anything interesting." That made Evelyn smile briefly and fiercely. "There's one more thing," Nathaniel said. He looked at me steadily. "Dennis, your brother. Whatever she told you, whatever she told him, you need to call him. But not from the house. Not from any phone she has access to." He was right. I had not spoken to my brother properly in years, and the distance between us had Serena's fingerprints all over it. "I'll call him from the airport," I said. We talked for another hour, working through the details, filling in the gaps. When Nathaniel finally stood to leave, Evelyn stood with him and held his face in her hands again, and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "You found your way back." "You left the light on," he said. Her breath caught audibly. She pressed her lips together and nodded once, and he kissed her forehead. And then he looked at me over her shoulder with the expression of a man who has just found something he had stopped believing existed. I walked him to the door. In the hallway, he gripped my hand with both of his, that same grip, that same pressure I had felt 1,000 times on baseball diamonds and in hospital waiting rooms and at the bottom of ski slopes where he had fallen and gotten up again, and he held it for a moment without speaking. Then he left. I went back inside and closed the door and stood with my back against it. Evelyn was already in bed, but she was watching me across the room with her dark eyes in the low light, and she said, "Walter, it's going to be all right." I nodded. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I crossed the room and looked at the screen. Serena. A text message sent 11 minutes ago, time-stamped at 1:17 in the morning. "Hey, just checking in. Hope Evelyn is feeling better. I made your favorite pot roast for when you get home. Can't wait to see you both. Miss you." I set the phone face down on the nightstand and looked at my wife. "Yes," I said quietly. "It is. The hardest performance of my life lasted 47 days. I have never been an actor. I taught 8th grade history for 31 years, and the closest I came to performing was the annual reenactment of the Constitutional Convention that I staged every November with whatever combination of reluctant 13-year-olds fate had assigned me that year. I was not naturally gifted at pretending to be something I was not. But I walked through the front door of the house on Birchwood Lane on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, and Serena was in the kitchen, and she turned when she heard the door and her face arranged itself into that expression, warm, concerned, slightly relieved, that I had accepted without question for 7 years. And I smiled at her. I set down my bag. I said the drive from the airport had been long and I was tired, and whatever she had on the stove smelled good. And she believed me. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the days that followed. She believed me immediately, completely, without a flicker of doubt, which told me something important about how she had always seen me as a man too old and too grief-softened and too fundamentally decent to be capable of the kind of cold, sustained deception she had been practicing for 7 years. She had mistaken my kindness for simplicity. She had mistaken my trust for blindness. I intended to let her go on mistaking. I called Dennis from a payphone at Bradley International Airport before I even collected my luggage. There are almost no payphones left in America, but airports still have them tucked into corners near the older gates, relics of a previous era that nobody has gotten around to removing. I fed quarters into it and listened to my brother's voice for the first time in what felt like years, and when he answered and heard me, he went very quiet for a moment and then said, "Walter, I've been trying to reach you." I know," I said. "I'm sorry, Dennis, I should explain." "She told me you weren't taking calls," he said carefully. "For a long time, she told me you weren't up to talking. And then when I kept trying, she told me she said you'd told her that the calls were upsetting you, that you needed space from everyone for a while." The quarters I had left in my hand were very cold. "I never said that," I told him. "Not once. Not any version of it." A long silence on the line. "Then I figured something like that. Eventually. But by then it had been so long I didn't know how to start the conversation." His voice roughened slightly. "I've missed you, Walt." "I've missed you too," I said. "I'm going to fix this. I need a few more weeks. Can you trust me for a few more weeks?" "I've trusted you my whole life," he said. "A few more weeks is nothing." I hired the investigator through Daniel Marsh, who handled it with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been practicing law for 30 years and has learned that the most important skill in his profession is not asking unnecessary questions. The investigator's name was Paul Garrett, former state police, 17 years in private practice, a flat, precise manner that suggested he had seen most of what human beings were capable of and had made his peace with it. He met me at Daniel's office on a Wednesday morning, and I gave him what I had, and he told me what he would need, and 3 weeks later he sent me a package that I opened at Daniel's office rather than at home. The photographs were taken at the Hartford Ritz-Carlton. 8 separate visits over the course of 6 weeks, each one documented with timestamps and billing confirmations. Marcus Holt was a heavy-set man in his early 50s with silver hair and the comfortable bearing of someone accustomed to expensive hotels. In every photograph, Serena looked relaxed in a way I had never seen her look at home, her posture open, her face unguarded, laughing at something he said with her head thrown back. She had never laughed like that at our kitchen table. The credit card she used for these visits was a supplementary card attached to a household account that Evelyn and I had maintained since 2001. She charged the rooms to it with the same casual ease with which she charged our grocery deliveries and Evelyn's prescription pickups. $14,200 in hotel charges over 6 weeks. From our account, Daniel had pulled together the full financial picture, by then working backward through 7 years of statements. The pattern was consistent, and in retrospect, almost elegant small withdrawals from multiple accounts, never large enough to trigger automatic alerts, never clustered close enough together to suggest coordination. 4,500 here, 6,000 there. A wire transfer of 12,000 in the spring of 2021 that had been logged as a home repair expense with a contractor receipt attached, that Daniel's contact at the county assessor's office confirmed had never been filed. $340,000. Over 7 years. From people who trusted her with every aspect of their lives. I sat with those bank statements spread across Daniel's conference table, and I pressed my palms flat on the surface and I breathed. There's more, Daniel said. He slid a folder across the table. I had a colleague pull the inquiry logs from the estate planning database we use. Someone ran a search on your file 8 months ago using access credentials registered to a firm on Asylum Avenue. The search included your will, your beneficiary designations, and the deed to the Birchwood property. I opened the folder. The law firm listed on the access log was not Daniel's firm. She retained her own attorney, I said. She retained her own attorney, Daniel confirmed. The inquiry included a specific question about intestate succession in Connecticut, in cases where there is no surviving direct heir and the estate had not been updated to reflect changed family circumstances. I closed the folder. How long to build a case that holds? I asked. Daniel looked at me over his reading glasses. Nathaniel can get us the medical transfer documents. He's already working on it. Then 4 weeks, Daniel said. Maybe 3. I drove home from that meeting along the same roads I had driven for 30 years, past the same landmarks, the same intersections, the same strip of commercial storefronts on New Britain Avenue that had changed its tenants 6 times since Nathaniel was in grade school. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. Nothing was. Serena had dinner on the table when I walked in. Roast chicken and green beans and the dinner rolls she made from scratch because she knew I liked them. She asked about my day and poured water into my glass without being asked and told me a story about something that had happened at the grocery store that afternoon. Something small and ordinary, and she laughed at the right moment in the story, and I laughed too. That evening she mentioned, for the 3rd time since I had been home, that it might be worth calling the estate attorney to update our documents. You're right, I said, cutting into my chicken. I'll make an appointment. She smiled, reached over and patted my hand. I just want to make sure you're taken care of, she said. That's all. I looked at her hand on mine. Then I looked up at her face. I know, I said. You always have been. There are things a man can absorb and keep moving. I had spent 47 days absorbing things and kept moving through all of them. The hotel receipts, the bank statements, the attorney's access logs, the 7 years of careful patient theft, conducted under my own roof by someone I had called family. I had absorbed all of it and kept my face neutral and passed the dinner rolls and said thank you for the pot roast. But what I found in the 3rd week of November broke something that I am not sure will ever fully mend. It started with a phone call from Dr. Heller's office. Eleanor Heller had been Evelyn's cardiologist for 11 years, a precise, no-nonsense woman from Cleveland, who had the manner of someone who considered sentimentality a form of imprecision. Her office called on a Tuesday morning while Serena was at the grocery store, and the woman on the line identified herself as Dr. Heller's scheduler and said they were doing a routine follow-up on patients who had missed appointments. Evelyn Reed, she said, had 3 missed appointments on file going back 14 months. They had been sending reminder letters to the Birchwood Lane address. Had Mrs. Reed received them? I told her I would look into it and called Dr. Heller directly. Eleanor Heller picked up her own line, which was unusual, and when I explained who I was and why I was calling, her voice shifted into something careful and measured. She told me that over the past 2 years, a woman identifying herself as Evelyn's daughter-in-law and primary caregiver had contacted the office on multiple occasions. This woman had rescheduled appointments, relayed messages purportedly from Evelyn declining certain recommended tests, and on 2 occasions had spoken with Dr. Heller directly about Evelyn's cognitive state, describing episodes of confusion and memory loss that Dr. Heller said she had never personally observed during any examination. I want to be direct with you, Mr. Reed," Dr. Heller said. "The picture this woman painted of your wife was significantly more alarming than anything I have seen in my own clinical assessments. Had I relied solely on her account, I would have recommended a referral to a memory care specialist months ago." I asked Dr. Heller whether she had ever spoken to me personally about any of this. A pause. "No," she said. "When I suggested it, the woman said you were not in good health and that managing these conversations was her responsibility. She said you had given her your medical power of attorney. I had given Serena no such thing. A medical power of attorney is a specific legal document in Connecticut that must be signed, witnessed, and notarized to be valid. I had signed no such document. I had certainly never authorized anyone to speak on my behalf to my wife's physician about my own health. She had invented it. Verbally, without documentation, to a doctor's office administrator who had no reason to question a concerned family member. It was not the kind of lie that left a paper trail. It was the kind of lie that simply occupied a space and redirected traffic around it quietly and efficiently until the space it occupied had been closed off for so long that nobody remembered there had ever been a road there. I drove to Sunrise Gardens Care Center on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November. It was a 40-minute drive from Birchwood Lane out past the reservoir, in a town I had no reason to visit and had never particularly noticed. A pleasant-looking facility from the outside, brick facade, well-maintained grounds, a row of bare maples along the front walk that would probably be beautiful in October. Evelyn was sitting in a chair by the window of her room when I arrived. She was wearing the blue cardigan she kept at the back of her closet for cold weather, and she was reading a paperback novel, and when I walked through the door, she looked up, and her face did something that I felt in every bone in my body. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to the expression of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time and had begun just barely to doubt it was coming. "Walter," she said. "Hi, Evie," I said. I crossed the room and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in mine, and she looked at me for a long moment with those sharp, dark eyes that had not changed in 40 years, and she said, "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," I told her. "But we have everything we need." She nodded slowly. "She told me you agreed to this, that you thought it was best." Her voice was entirely steady. "I knew you hadn't. You would have talked to me first. You have always talked to me first. I'm talking to you now," I said. "I know." She squeezed my hands. "Get me out of here, Walter." I had already spoken to Daniel Marsh. Under Connecticut law, placing a competent adult in a care facility without their genuine informed consent through misrepresentation to medical professionals constitutes elder abuse, a criminal offense that carries significant penalties, including felony charges and civil liability. The forged authorization that Serena had used to facilitate Evelyn's admission, she had submitted a document purporting to bear my signature as Evelyn's co-decision maker, was an additional count of forgery under Connecticut statute. Daniel had contacted a criminal attorney colleague that morning. The documentation was already being compiled. I checked Evelyn out of Sunrise Gardens that same afternoon. The administrator at the front desk asked whether she had discussed this with her caregiver. I told her politely that I was Evelyn's husband of 40 years, and I would be taking my wife home, and that any questions about authorization could be directed to Daniel Marsh, whose card I placed on the desk. We did not go to Birchwood Lane. I drove Evelyn to Dennis's house in Glastonbury, where my brother met us at the door with his wife, Carol, and pulled Evelyn into a hug that lasted a full minute and made her laugh through her tears. Because Dennis had always been able to make her do that, even when nothing was funny. That evening, sitting at Dennis's kitchen table with coffee and Carol's apple cake, I called Nathaniel. "We have everything," I told him. A pause on the line. Then, the party is in 3 weeks. December 14th. She told me about it last week. She is organizing a family dinner at the house. Full attendance, she said. Everyone she has spent 7 years performing for. Then December 14th. I said, Dad. His voice was steady and clear across 4,000 miles of ocean. Bring Mom. I looked across the table at Evelyn, who was laughing at something Dennis had said, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her blue cardigan bright under the kitchen light. 7 years of candles. 7 years of a chair kept empty at holiday tables. 7 years of a woman refusing to stop lighting the way home for someone she refused to stop believing in. She'll be there, I said. We both will. I hung up the phone. Serena called 12 minutes later. Her voice was warm and easy, that familiar practiced warmth, asking when I was planning to come home for dinner and whether I wanted her to pick up anything from the market. I told her I was visiting Dennis, that we had been out of touch too long, that I would be home tomorrow. Of course, she said. Take all the time you need. I'll keep everything ready for you here. I looked at my brother across the table. He raised his coffee mug slightly. Thank you, Serena, I said. I'll see you tomorrow. The package from Lisbon arrived on a Wednesday morning in the last week of November. Nathaniel had sent it through a courier service rather than standard mail, tracked insured, requiring a signature. And I signed for it at Daniel Marsh's office rather than at Birchwood Lane, because I had been receiving all correspondence of consequence at Daniel's office for 6 weeks by then, and had given the staff there instructions to call me on Dennis's landline if anything arrived that looked important. Everything important arrived at Daniel's office now. Birchwood Lane received grocery deliveries and utility bills, and the occasional catalog for garden supplies that neither Evelyn nor I had ever ordered from, but which had been arriving faithfully for 11 years. I opened the package at Daniel's conference table with Daniel and Paul Garrett present. Nathaniel had been thorough in the way that surgeons are thorough, not because thoroughness is exciting, but because incompleteness kills people. The package contained 4 categories of documents, each separated by a labeled divider and arranged in chronological order. The first category was his original intake records from Harborview Rehabilitation Center in Portland, Maine, 47 pages of medical documentation, beginning with the emergency admission record, dated November 19, 2017. The admitting diagnosis, severe traumatic brain injury with associated retrograde amnesia. The patient had been transferred from Maine Medical Center, where he had been stabilized following a motor vehicle accident on Interstate 95. The transfer had been authorized by the patient's spouse, one Serena Reed of Hartford, Connecticut, who had identified herself as the sole next of kin and had signed all relevant consent and transfer documentation. Her signature was on 11 separate documents in those 47 pages. The second category was the billing records from Harborview, 3 months of residential care, charged to a Visa card ending in 4 digits, that Daniel's financial investigator cross-referenced against Serena's personal account records. Not the household account. Her own account, the one she had opened in her name alone in January of 2018, 2 months after Nathaniel's admission, funded by the first of the irregular withdrawals that would total $340,000 over the following 7 years. She had paid for his care out of stolen money. There was something in that fact that went beyond ordinary calculation, a coldness so complete it had its own kind of architecture. The third category was what Nathaniel had described in his cover letter as the most important document in the package. It was a single-page, a discharge summary prepared by Harborview's Chief of Neurology, Dr. Raymond Prescott, dated February 14, 2018. The summary noted that the patient had made significant progress in cognitive rehabilitation and that his prognosis for continued improvement was favorable, contingent on ongoing therapeutic support. It also noted in the careful, neutral language of medical documentation that the patient's spouse had elected to discontinue inpatient care against the medical team's recommendation, citing personal and financial considerations, and had arranged independent discharge. Dr. Prescott had written one additional line at the bottom of the summary in a section marked, "Attending physician notes patient. Expressed uncertainty about discharge plan." Patient asked on 3 separate occasions whether his family had been contacted. Patient was told by spouse that there was no other family. Daniel read that line twice. Then he set the paper down and looked at me over his reading glasses and said nothing, which was the most expressive I had ever seen him. The 4th category was a set of photographs. Not Paul Garrett's surveillance photographs, which we already had, but images Nathaniel had taken with his phone of a bulletin board in the staff lounge at Hôpital de Luz. 7 years ago, shortly after arriving in Lisbon, he had pinned a single index card to that board, with one sentence written on it in his own handwriting. A kind of anchor, he had explained in his letter, something to hold on to when the absence of memory became too heavy. The sentence read, "Someone is looking for me. I just don't know it yet." He had kept it there for 7 years. Paul Garrett submitted the full evidentiary package to the Hartford Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit on the 1st of December. The detective assigned to the case was a methodical man named Roger Callahan, who had spent 22 years investigating financial fraud and elder abuse, and who called Daniel's office 3 days later to confirm that the package was, in his words, one of the most comprehensively documented cases of sustained financial deception he had reviewed in his career. 3 days before the party, I drove home from Daniel's office that evening, along the same route I had driven for 30 years, and I pulled into the driveway of the house on Birchwood Lane, and I sat in the car for a moment, looking at the lit windows. Serena had the kitchen light on. I could see her moving past the window, stirring something on the stove, reaching for something on the shelf above it. Ordinary domestic motion framed in yellow light, exactly as it had appeared every evening for 7 years. I went inside. She had made chicken soup. She ladled it into a bowl and set it in front of me and sat across the table and asked how my day had been, and I told her it had been quiet, and she nodded and said she was glad that I deserved some quiet after everything we had been through. That night, around 10 o'clock, she appeared in the doorway of the living room where I was reading and held out a small glass of warm milk. She did this occasionally, said it helped with sleep, that she had read an article about the calming properties of warm milk before bed and wanted to make sure I was resting well. I took the glass, thanked her, watched her go back to the kitchen. Then I stood up, walked to the downstairs bathroom, poured the milk quietly into the sink, rinsed the glass, and set it on the edge of the tub. I am not saying she put anything in it. I am saying that after everything I had learned about Serena over the past 7 years, her patience, her thoroughness, her capacity for doing small, careful things over long periods of time in service of an outcome nobody else could see, I was no longer willing to accept anything from her hands without thinking about it first. I went back to the living room and sat down and picked up my book. 3 days, I thought. Just 3 more days. I have a habit that Evelyn has been teasing me about for 30 years. When something important is going to happen the next day, something I cannot control, something I can only prepare for and then surrender to, I do not sleep. I lie in the dark, and I run through every variable I can identify, every contingency I can anticipate, every way the thing could go wrong, and what I would do if it did. Evelyn calls it my pre-game ritual, which she says with the particular affectionate exasperation of a woman who has watched her husband lie rigid beside her the night before every first day of school, every parent-teacher conference, every minor surgical procedure for 40 years. She was at Dennis's house. I was alone in the house on Birchwood Lane, and I was not in our bedroom. I was sitting on the edge of the bed in Nathaniel's old room in the dark, with my hands on my knees and the door open behind me, listening to the house settle around me the way old houses do in December. the tick and creak of wood contracting in the cold, the furnace cycling on and off in the basement. The particular quality of nighttime quiet that is not actually quiet at all once you learn to hear it. Serena had done something to this room that I had not noticed until I was sitting alone in it at 11 o'clock on the night of December 13th. She had kept it perfectly. Every certificate still hung on the wall in the same position. The medical school diploma, the undergraduate honors citation, the regional science fair ribbon from 2001 that Nathaniel had won for a project on water filtration that he had been so proud of, he had refused to throw away even after he graduated. The bookshelf still held his textbooks in the same order: Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, Robbins' Pathology, the battered copy of Gray's Anatomy with the broken spine and the highlighted passages. The desk still had his old lamp on it, the adjustable one with the green glass shade that he had bought at a yard sale his freshman year of college. Nothing had been touched. Nothing had been moved. Everything was exactly as he had left it 7 years ago, preserved with a fidelity that I had always read as grief, as the painful loving inability of a widow to alter the space where her husband had grown up, because altering it would mean accepting that he was not coming back. I understood now what it actually was. It was a stage set. It was the most important prop in the performance Serena had been giving for 7 years, the grieving daughter-in-law, who could not bear to touch her dead husband's childhood room, who kept it like a shrine, who sat in it sometimes when she missed him, and let whoever happened to witness it draw whatever conclusions the moment suggested. The room was evidence of devotion. The room was the thing people pointed to when they said, "What a remarkable woman, what a loyal wife, what a heartbreaking loss." The room was a lie like everything else. I sat with that understanding for a long time in the quiet of December, in the dark of a room that smelled faintly of old paper and the cedar blocks Evelyn put in all the closets every autumn. And then I stopped thinking about Serena entirely. I thought about the boy who had lived in this room, who had stayed up past midnight studying for organic chemistry examinations with a mug of black coffee and music playing low enough not to wake us, who had called me from his first apartment in a panic because he had overcooked his first attempt at Thanksgiving turkey, and the smoke detector was going off, and he had 12 friends coming in 40 minutes, who had driven home from his residency program on a Saturday morning to sit with an old dog in a veterinarian's examination room so that his father would not have to do it alone. I thought about a man who had woken up in a hospital bed with no name and no memory, and no one sitting beside him except the person who had put him there, and who had chosen, in spite of all of that, to become something good, something excellent even, who had made himself into a physician of genuine skill and genuine compassion without a single piece of his past to stand on. I thought about a bulletin board in a staff lounge in Lisbon, Portugal, with a single index card pinned to it for 7 years. Someone is looking for me. I just don't know it yet. He had been right. I had been looking for him in everything for 7 years. In the photograph on the mantelpiece. In the sound of a voice on the telephone that was the wrong voice. In the empty chair at the Thanksgiving table that Evelyn set and cleared without comment every year because neither of us could bring ourselves to stop setting it. I had been looking for him. And 3 weeks ago in a hospital in Lisbon, a city neither of us had ever been to before, Evelyn had ordered the wrong thing for breakfast and had an allergic reaction to shellfish. And because of that, because of a plate of food and a fortunate coincidence, and whatever it is that arranges these things, which I am not too old or too private to call by its proper name, I had found him. I pressed my hands together and bent my head, and I thanked God. Plainly and completely, and without embarrassment, the way you thank someone who has given you back something you had stopped believing you would ever hold again. I thanked him for Lisbon. I thanked him for Evelyn's stubbornness about that blue scarf. I thanked him for Raymond Prescott and his healer's hands, and his willingness to sit with a frightened young man who had nothing and see something in him worth saving. I was still sitting there when my phone buzzed at 5:47 in the morning. Not a call. A text from Nathaniel sent from Lisbon, where it was already approaching noon. Landed in New York an hour ago. Driving up with Dennis. See you tonight, Dad. I read it 3 times. Then I heard Serena's voice from the hallway outside the partially open door. She was on her phone, speaking in the low, careful tone of someone who does not want to be overheard in a house they believe to be sleeping. I held completely still. Everything is on track, she said. Her voice was smooth and unhurried entirely, unlike the warm, slightly breathless register she used when she spoke to me. The party is tonight. He has no idea. After this week, we move forward with the paperwork. Just be patient a little longer. A pause while the other person responded. I know, she said. I know it has taken a long time. But it is almost done, Marcus. It is almost done. She moved away down the hallway. Her footsteps descended the stairs. I sat in my son's old room in the early morning dark, with his diploma on the wall and his textbooks on the shelf and his lamp with the green glass shade on the desk, and I looked at the text message on my phone screen. See you tonight, Dad. I typed back 2 words. We're ready. She had decorated the dining room with white candles, dozens of them arranged along the center of the table and on the sideboard, and the windowsills, their light warm and flickering against the December dark outside. It was beautiful in the way that things constructed entirely for effect can sometimes be accidentally beautiful. 15 people sat around the table, cousins, neighbors, the friends who had been coming to holiday dinners at this house for 20 years. Serena moved among them like a woman entirely at home in her own happiness, refilling glasses, laughing at the right moments, touching shoulders as she passed. She lifted her wine glass at 8 o'clock. To family, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. To the people who stay. I stood up. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Not all at once, but in a ripple, one conversation stopping, and then another until the silence was complete, and everyone was looking at me. You're right, I said. Family should stay. Which is why I need to tell everyone something. Serena's smile held for exactly 3 seconds. I told them. Not everything there was not time for everything, and some things belonged to Nathaniel to say in his own words at his own moment. But enough. I told them about Lisbon. About the doctor who had walked through a hospital door and been standing there alive for 7 years while we lit candles for him. About Portland, Maine, and a signature on 11 transfer documents and $340,000 moved in small, careful increments from our accounts into hers. Serena set her wine glass down on the table. Her hand was shaking. Walter, she said. Her voice had dropped into something I had never heard from her before. Not warmth, not concern, but the sound of a person calculating very quickly how much damage had been done and whether any of it could still be contained. Walter, I don't know what you think you found, but... The dining room door opened. Nathaniel walked in. He was wearing a dark suit, and he needed a haircut. And he looked exactly like his grandfather had looked at 40. And the room made a sound. Not a word. Not a scream, just a collective intake of breath, 15 people reaching simultaneously for air that had suddenly become insufficient. Serena's wine glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the tablecloth, and the red wine spread outward in a slow, dark bloom across the white linen, and she stood completely still, staring at my son, and the color left her face so completely and so quickly that the woman who remained looked like someone I had never seen before. because she was. The Serena I had known for 7 years, warm, devoted, indispensable, did not exist. She had never existed, and the person standing in her place, stripped of every layer of careful performance, was simply a stranger in my dining room. "Hello, Serena," Nathaniel said. His voice was entirely calm. "It's been a long time." I walked to the door and opened it. Detective Roger Callahan stepped in from the front hallway, his badge in his hand, with 2 uniformed officers behind him. He had been waiting in an unmarked car at the end of Birchwood Lane since 7:30. The arrest took less than 4 minutes. When they walked Serena out through the front door, she did not say anything. She did not look at me. She looked at Nathaniel once with an expression I cannot fully describe. Not remorse, not anger, but something colder and more final, the look of a person who has made a calculation and arrived at the wrong answer and knows it. Marcus Holt was arrested at his apartment on the same evening. After they were gone, the room was very still. Then, the dining room door opened again, and Evelyn walked in from the hallway where she had been standing with Dennis, and Nathaniel turned and saw his mother, and every careful composure he had maintained through that entire evening left him all at once. He crossed the room in 4 steps. She met him halfway. I stood at the head of the table in my dining room, with the white candles burning and the red wine still spreading slowly across the white linen. And I watched my wife hold our son, and I pressed both hands flat against my chest over my heart, and I breathed. Outside, the December night was clear and very cold and full of stars. This is my family story. Not a perfect one. Not the kind you plan for. I am just a grandfather, and Grandpa's stories like mine do not come with warnings. They arrive the way that evening in Lisbon arrived. Quietly, then all at once. Here is what I know now that I did not know before. I trusted too easily. I grieved too privately. I let one person stand between me and everyone I loved, and I called it kindness when it was really blindness. If your instincts are telling you something is wrong, listen. I did not listen soon enough. Please do not make my mistake. God gave my son back to me in a hospital room, in a city I had never visited, through a plate of shellfish and 40 years of a marriage stubborn enough to survive everything. I do not have a better explanation than that, and I have stopped looking for one. Family story after family story has taught me this love is not fragile. It bends. It waits. It lights a candle in the window every single night, until the person it is waiting for finally finds their way home. These grandpa stories belong to all of us now. If this story reached you, leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done differently. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are new here, subscribe because the next story is already waiting. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted for reflection and heart. If that is not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what feeds your soul.